Hey, y'all. So as we round out 2022, we're rounding up our episodes about the biggest stories of the year. I'm here with co-host Dayvid Figler.
Hey, Sonja.
Hey. And today on CityCast Las Vegas, we're bringing you a conversation we had with our newsletter editor, Scott Dickensheets, about the murder of journalist Jeff German. Okay, so Dayvid, what's happened in the Tellez trial since our episode came out in early September?
Well, there's a lot that happened, most of which is very standard for a murder case in Clark County. He was indicted by the grand jury. It was brought by the Clark County District Attorney's Office. The Clark County District Attorney announced that they were not going to be seeking a death penalty, which is something we discussed in the podcast. Tellez predictably pled not guilty. The trial date was set for April 17th, but other kind of interesting things popped up. There was a big controversy. Metro was looking to get into the telephones and the sources of Jeff German. The RJ vigorously defending against that, claiming, First Amendment protections and journalistic ethics and the whole thing. Tellez himself changed lawyers 3 times, which is,
wow,
a little unusual so early in the case. He had somebody who I believe might have been his friend, a well-known defense attorney named Travis Shetler, who kind of handled the initial stuff. Also, the removal of Tellez as the public administrator, which went through a judicial proceeding. But then Travis was out and the public defender came in. Now, that was in itself controversial because Tellez apparently has access to some resources, money, that is, where he could afford his own private attorney. But murder cases are a little bit different. He had a great set of public defenders who had tons and tons of murder experience. So, by all accounts, he was in good hands. But then he fired his own public defender and hired another fairly well-known defense attorney in town, but not someone particularly well-known for doing murder cases. So also very interesting. But, having 3 different lawyers so early in a case, I mean, it's not unprecedented, but it maybe is a little bit red flag that something else is up. So, between now and April, we'll see if the defense needs more time to prepare its defense or if they come to some manner of negotiation with the prosecution. But kind of that's where we are.
Yeah, we'll be following this story, of course, closely, as the months go on. But what you said earlier about the investigators trying to look into Jeff German's sources, that ties into the conversation we had with Scott, because as you all know by now, listeners, Dayvid is a lawyer and Scott is a journalist, and they had special insight into that dynamic that Tellez and German had. German was obviously an investigative journalist and Tellez was a lawyer.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway from that was really the unique perspectives that both Scott and I brought from our respective professions, right? So, being someone who has been reported upon for doing law work, which essentially is what Tellez did, and Scott's perspective of what this kind of means to journalists to see one of their colleagues to allegedly fall to the hands of one of the subjects of their investigative pieces. It's pretty problematic.
Yeah, and I think also the rising sense that journalists have of being under attack, and that sense of fear and uncertainty in this era of mainstream media kind of decriers, right? Quote unquote.
Yeah, and Scott and I also talk about, potential motives about the whole thing because it didn't really seem like some office gossip about bullying and maybe romantic encounters was that big a deal, like to motivate someone to kill another human being. But, since then, as we sort of speculated, there was additional German investigation going on. And it turns out he was investigating potential financial misdealings directly by Tellez, profiting off of administering the estates of dead people. And so that is kind of a developing story and possibly ties right back into what we talked about, the motive of the public administrator to kill the journalist who was reporting on him.
Right. Well, this conversation is a doozy. It's a good one. And I'm excited for our listeners to hear it. It's Thursday, December 29th, 2022. I'm Sonja Cho Swanson, and this is CityCast Las Vegas. All right, you guys, how are we feeling with the fire hose today? Are we just completely blind? Are we blind, deaf, and dumb at this point? How are we doing?
Well, it always is hard when we're talking about a death of someone who's been in our community for a really long time. It's also kind of that double edge of sadness when the national spotlight is on Las Vegas for something involving violence and death. But how about you, Scott? You're a journalist, and this was a journalist who was killed. I think you knew Jeff German, yeah?
Yeah, we were acquaintances at best. We shared some time in the Las Vegas Sun newsroom a few decades ago. So yeah, this is a quite somber time for me and those of my friends who knew Jeff pretty well. Again, like I said, I knew him glancingly. I don't want to pretend to a greater intimacy than I had with him, but we were colleagues and we did bump into each other on the regular back in the Sun newsroom.
Yeah, same here. He covered a lot of court proceedings, and I would often see him sometimes have spirited conversations, especially if he wanted to comment on one of my tweets that maybe was a little critical of some of his coverage. But that said, I'm the same, Scott. I don't want to take anything away from people who are actually close or friends with him.
Yeah. Well, to start us off, why don't I give us a very brief timeline of the events that led up to the most recent events of this week. So in May to June of this year, Jeff German releases several articles that detail allegations of emotional stress, favoritism, bullying, as well as video of an affair that Tellez was allegedly having an affair with a subordinate staffer. Robert Tellez is kind of this obscure elected official. He's the Clark County administrator. We'll, I'm sure, get more into that. And then in June, Tellez loses his bid in the primaries, supposedly thanks to German's reporting. And then more recently, on Saturday morning, one of German's neighbors reports finding him unresponsive on the ground, and it turns out he has died of stab wounds. And video footage of a person now alleged to be Tellez is seen coming to and from the home, driving a vehicle that matches Tellez's vehicle. Tellez is arrested yesterday in a highly publicized, dramatic event. It turns out he has self-inflicted wounds, and he is brought to court and formal charges of murder are given. So that's kind of the brief timeline. Dayvid, maybe can you tell us a little bit more about the articles that German published that possibly led to Tellez losing the primary?
Sure. And as much, Sonja, as we're talking about an ongoing and pending criminal case, I think I would be betraying my training as a criminal defense lawyer
Sure.
who's, sworn to uphold the Constitution to not give the disclaimer that, what we're talking about are facts that have been revealed to the public. But as far as the guilt or innocence of Robert Tellez, have to acknowledge, and rightfully so, the cornerstone of democracy, that he is innocent until proven otherwise.
Yes, no, absolutely.
So with regard to the articles, what German did was go very in-depth in this. He did some public records requests. He did a lot of interviews. Tellez actually allowed them into the office to be confronted about it. He denied that there was any kind of misdoing or bad behavior as being alleged against him. The RJ also had video journalism involved in this, and they were able to come across some videotape of what appeared to be Robert Tellez and one of the employees in the back of a vehicle across the street from the government center doing whatever. They said they were just talking. People were suggesting it might have been a lot more than that. And Rob Tellez is a married person. He has 3 kids. So obviously all that was highly embarrassing. The insinuation was strong. The implication was that he was an incompetent administrator, and this was right during an election season where the election was coming up, and as you stated as well, he came in 3rd place running against other employees of his own office, which probably makes it very... If it was a hostile environment before, I can't imagine that didn't make it better. There hadn't been any new reporting, although there is a suggestion that German was picking up the trail and doing some kind of new reporting on the public administrator and Mr. Tellez at the time of his murder. We don't know what that is yet, though.
Scott, tell us more about Jeff German. What was his reputation like in Las Vegas?
I think he was sort of generally well known as a dogged reporter. He had a lot of contacts out there, a lot of sources, a lot of tipsters. I remember him from my days at the Las Vegas Sun just constantly on his phone. People would always be calling him with little leads, little tips, little ideas. And that was a newsroom full of characters. And Jeff held his own. He was not super larger than life, but he was definitely a presence in the newsroom. I think his reputation was sort of as a dogged, facts-forward kind of reporter and writer.
Mm-hmm.
Very well respected. Very well respected.
Yeah, by all accounts, had just had kind of like a storied career over 40 years in Las Vegas. Now to kind of turn our attention a little bit to Rob Tellis. Scott, what do we know about Tellis?
Oh, well, he'd been here for like 20 years or so. Got a law degree, I think, in 2014 or so from the Boyd Law School. He was elected as public administrator in 2018. It's his first political job. There's sort of like a split in opinion, it seems like. He worked with a lot of community service agencies and organizations, and they've been quoted as saying, like, he was really committed to service. He was a really friendly guy and all that. That sort of gentle public-facing sort of demeanor that one has. But then, you hear from his employees that they were frightened of him. They were afraid for their lives. They felt bullied. They felt like some fear of retaliation. So it's really sort of an interesting dual portrait that sort of arises from the bare facts that we have. Right.
It's interesting to hear you bring up that point that, a person can be different people to different people in their lives. It's like you can be such a kind and warm, gentle person to like in this one sphere of your life and then maybe a monster in another. So
absolutely,
we contain multitudes. So maybe let's get into like that presser Thursday morning from the Las Vegas Metro Police Department, because it was a little shorter than I expected, but we did get a little bit of new information. What evidence does the state have against Tellis so far?
So it was a little short, and they definitely cut it off. So, little bits and pieces of information have been revealed by the police department as we go. So initially, we saw the picture of an individual wearing an outfit that was unusual, reflective vest and a straw hat, some gloves and a duffel bag in the area. We saw the car that was this maroon GMC of a certain year frame. And then what they told us at the presser today was that the car they believe that was involved in the murder was registered to Tellis's wife. It was also previously revealed that it was seen in his driveway after the murder, and there was video footage of that. And then today we also learned that during the searches of Tellis's home, that they found a straw hat cut up in pieces that appeared to be similar to the one depicted in the video that was released. They found tennis shoes or shoes that looked like they were the ones of the individual who were in there that were also cut up that had apparent blood on it. And so that was really it from the presser itself. They didn't give a lot more information. They said this is an ongoing investigation. They kind of talked about how they got to where they got and that they had been in consultation with the DA's office. And then after the presser, some hours later, he was arraigned in court where he was formally charged with open murder. And some additional facts were revealed by the prosecutor that there was some DNA found underneath the fingernails of Jeff Garriman. We also found out a little bit about the self-inflicted wounds from that court proceeding. It appears that they were superficial wounds to his own arms. I mean, we don't know if there were other people involved, if it was by himself or otherwise, if he is alleged to be the actual person, although it does seem to be pointing that that is the theory of prosecution here, that this was premeditated, that he showed up with a weapon, that he used the weapon, that Garriman tried to defend himself, that DNA was left behind, and that evidence associated with the offense itself was found either in the possession of Rob Tellis or at his home.
All right, I'm going to say something that might sound a little controversial, but when I saw the cut-up hat during the presser, I was like, man, have you not listened to a murder podcast? Like, this is not the way to get rid of evidence. It just, I really had to question his state of mind, and it makes you wonder, you know?
Yeah, I mean, he's only been practicing law a short period of time, maybe.
Oh, man. Yeah, not to get too macabre or anything.
But yeah, I mean, look, if this was a premeditated murder, as it will be alleged, it didn't seem very thoughtful or thought out. Not like any murder ever is thoughtful. But yeah, it doesn't seem like he did a good job in covering his tracks if that was his intention all along. I mean, there's going to be more about...
Well, he drove his own car to the scene.
Well, and you know, how these things develop is kind of a matter of one of a few different pathways, either seeking a quick plea bargain or suggesting he wasn't there, or that he was under some sort of, you know, mental frame of mind, or that it actually was meant to be something else and that, you know, Garriman attacked him first. Or I mean, there's a few different ways that it can go, and that is yet to be seen.
Scott, I kind of want to hear your journalist perspective on this, because I feel like one of the undercurrent or like themes that I keep hearing about is like attacks on journalists.
I guess the climate that journalists have been operating in has been slowly getting like hotter and more uncomfortable. Any number of opinion polls will show that the media in general has a pretty low approval rating amongst people. And people on both the right and the left are often casting aspersions on the media. And former President Trump famously declared the media, enemies of the people. And so I think all of that creates a climate in which, a journalist sort of, has a certain anxiety about going about his job, especially if he's in one of the tougher, grittier lines of work like investigative reporting. I mean,
sure.
If you're an arts journalist, you're probably not facing, the same, sets of angry people that you might be if you were ripping the lid off of City Hall.
Although some artists can be really cranky.
Oh,
but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, because they don't underestimate artists.
So I think there's a sort of a growing sense over the last, any number of years that it's becoming more and more dangerous to be a journalist, especially if you have one of those frontline sort of jobs. So, a glance at the international headlines will show you that a lot of journalists are already sort of paying with their lives for doing the work that they do.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise that journalists everywhere, including here, are feeling a lot of extra pressure these days.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think right away of the reporters down in Mexico report on the narco systems down there, and then they wind up dead, just like, any officials who speak out about it. And it's very hot. And I see that line coming here a lot, because I don't want to call it an easy narrative, but I think we also have to remember that, in any murder case, and this is, just my experience, there's very, very human dynamics, like the assailant, what is wrong with the assailant and their way of thinking? How does an assailant go from a slight that came from even losing a job to violence, right? And so what is that progression? That is lost in the conversation, as opposed to the narrative where this is just an attack on journalism itself. So that nuance is hard, right?
Yeah, I would never want to sort of imply that Jeff's tragic death is just sort of symptomatic of a larger thing. I mean, it's every incident has its own particulars, but I do think as to the larger context, there is sort of a growing sense amongst journalists that that this is not always, the easiest profession to follow.
Oh, I totally agree with that. But to make that the prime narrative, which I've been seeing, so far on people talking about it, or, even the dynamic of some of the reporting on it is more, is this endemic of the assault on journalism in general? And so I think that those are two very different things, and it's easy to talk about them in the same breath. But I think we also have to remember that every murder case has its own dynamics. And there was obviously something very, very personal here, as opposed to some sort of generic attack on journalism.
What I'm seeing as a difference is that this was in no way sanctioned by authorities, right? This was in no way sanctioned or encouraged by authorities.
Yeah, I don't think this is a message about fake news, or something like that, even though the guy denied. And again, if he is the one who did this, he denied that the reporting was accurate and got that word out.
But you also have to wonder, how much of the broader narrative of distrust or mistrust in journalism, or I think some of his tweets kind of called Jeff's reporting into question, saying that Jeff was digging through his trash like a raccoon or something.
Yeah, he was
at
definitely,
one point, I'm sure that was stoking the flames of his resentment,
Oh, yeah, I don't think that any prosecutor anywhere would have a hard time, if the evidence matches up, to show not just motive, but that this was a festering disdain for the reporter who, had been revealing these things about his workplace, about his work style, maybe even about his personal life. But again, I don't think that this is a pushback under any sort of sanctioned rhetoric anywhere against, false reporting or too intensive reporting. Although the fact that it is a subject and a journalist who are in the mix as far as our conversation goes, it is there.
Yeah, and especially the kind of journalism that Jeff was doing. I mean, that accountability journalism is foundational to, what the press's role in the larger democracy is. I think that's one reason why there is such an intense spotlight on this case.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Scott, you've been a journalist now in Las Vegas for many years. I won't say how many.
Thank you.
What are some of your initial takeaways so far on the reporting that you've seen?
I think one takeaway, aside from all of the sort of really intense stuff David has been talking about, there was a line in one of the stories that probably very few people but me paid attention to, and it said, like, in the weeks leading up to, his death, Gehrman had been looking for more information on Tellus, and the word weeks stood out to me because I think that really underlines for me what a painstaking, unglamorous sort of work investigative journalism is, and how fewer and fewer media operations in this country are underwriting it. And because it's just not, you don't see the quick ROI that you do when you turn and burn quick content. And so kudos to the RJ for trying to get people to talk who don't want to talk or who are afraid to talk. You've got to dig through, just massive tranches of public information. And it's just like very painstaking. And so I'm glad that, that there are still a few pockets of that left, and I'm glad one of them is here.
I would say I'm really interested in kind of what he was working on too, and if that plays into the story, because he had made some public record requests. The public administrator, while an obscure position, is one that has not been without controversy. Prior public administrators have come under great scrutiny, allegations of financial misdealings.
What did they do again, David, actually?
So if a person dies with a estate of a certain size or assets of a certain size, and there's nobody who can come claim, there's no next of kin found, there's no executor by way of a will or something, the public administrator is the one that steps in and sort of manages and resolves that estate. They are, tasked with looking for heirs if they can't find heirs to dispose of that income, and money does flow. There are a lot of different opportunities without getting into the minutia of how the public administrator works. But, in the past, certainly there have been lots of allegations that the public administrator misused that office for personal gain. That's something that has been alleged in the past. I would say that of all the government positions, that is one that theoretically could be exploited if there was a bad player in there. And they deal with the courts a lot, and so they make representations, and they also have the ability to contract other people, and there would be opportunity for kickbacks and stuff. And I'm not saying any of that occurred here, just saying that it is a vulnerable area. So if Gehrman hadn't left the story alone because the guy was already out of office, he was only going to be there for a few more months, like what was coming next? And is that something that possibly motivated whatever it is that, happened in Rob Tellus's mind, allegedly.
Sure.
Allegedly. We have
Well,
to stick with that. I mean, that is important. It's, again, not just lip service. It's democracy. It's America.
Right. It's the law. Oh, man. Well, thank you both for this great conversation. I feel enlightened and also heartened, I think, by it, even though it's a heavy topic.
And, condolences to Jeff's family and friends who knew him, and
his colleagues at the Review Journal.
And his colleagues,
Yes.
he and I, like I said, may have disagreed sometime, but, such a loss, and no one deserves that. And so, heartfelt condolences to all.
That is all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, go tell a friend, send them this episode. Then make sure you're subscribed, you're following the show, make sure they're subscribed and following the show, and also subscribe to our brilliant morning newsletter. It's the best, I promise. Take care, y'all.